In the merciless storm, a luxury car stops at the entrance of a decaying hotel. An elderly lady with gentle eyes looks on in confusion as her son, in his impeccable suit, opens the door. "Wait here, mother. I'll secure a place for you to rest. Tonight." Minutes later, he returns to the car alone. He accelerates down the dark road, coldly glancing in the rearview mirror as his mother's silhouette vanishes in the distance. But destiny weaves its webs with invisible threads of justice. 10 years later, a diagnosis and an unexpected message. He was about to discover that some debts the universe always collects, with interest. A heart-wrenching story about the price of pride, the pain of late regret, and the unlikely miracle of forgiveness when there's no longer enough time to live it. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and transform lives, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of our special narratives. And now prepare your heart for an emotional journey of regret and redemption. The storm was mercilessly battering the small town of Pottery Valley that June night. The dark sky seemed to collapse in torrents of water, while lightning cut through the heavy clouds, momentarily illuminating the winding road leading to the center of the town. A gleaming black Mercedes-Benz advanced cautiously along the muddy road, the high-powered headlights trying to overcome the darkness of the stormy night. Inside the luxury vehicle, Richard Mendoza, a 45-year-old man wearing an impeccably tailored Italian suit, adjusted the gold watch on his wrist while driving with an impassive expression. Beside him, an elderly woman with gray hair and a gentle face looked out the window with tired, confused eyes. Helen, 72 years old, clutched a small worn leather purse against her chest, as if guarding her last hopes there. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly, a side effect of the disease she had recently discovered. "Son, are you sure we need to stay in this town? Couldn't we continue to the city?" asked Helen, her fragile voice nearly swallowed by the sound of rain hammering the car roof. Richard forced a reassuring smile, his cold eyes contrasting with the false sweetness in his voice. "Mum, you're too tired to continue traveling. This place has a very cozy traditional hotel. You'll be able to rest properly until I sort out the details of your new treatment." The car slowed down as it approached a roadside hotel. The illuminated Haven Lodge sign flickered frantically, with some letters no longer working. The establishment, far from looking cozy, had an air of decay, with peeling paint and poorly lit windows. "Wait here while I check if there are rooms available," said Richard, adjusting his suit before getting out of the car. The rain immediately hit his broad shoulders, but he walked with determination to the entrance of the hotel without showing any discomfort. In the dimly lit reception area, a sleepy young woman was flipping through a magazine. She looked up disinterestedly when the door opened, letting in the cold wind along with the elegant man who completely contrasted with the modest surroundings. "Good evening. I need a room for my mother," said Richard, maintaining a calculated distance from the aged counter. His eyes quickly scanned the place, noting the old wallpaper and worn armchairs in the small waiting area. "We have simple rooms available, sir. How long do you plan to stay?" asked the receptionist, already reaching for the registry book. "Just tonight," he replied dryly. "How much?" After hearing the price, Richard nodded. "I'll get my mother from the car. She's ill and needs to rest. I'll be back in a moment to settle the details." The businessman returned to the vehicle, where Helen waited with an apprehensive expression. "I got a room for you, Mum. Let's get inside before the rain gets worse." He opened the trunk and removed a small worn blue suitcase. It was all his mother owned after selling the simple house where she had lived for decades to move to the big city with her son, responding to his request after her diagnosis. With staged gentleness, Richard helped his mother out of the car, protecting her from the rain with a black umbrella. They walked slowly to the hotel entrance, she leaning on his firm arm. "Here we are," he said, leading her into the establishment. "The receptionist will show you to your room. I need to take care of some details in the car, and then I'll come back to help you get settled." Helen looked around with obvious discomfort. The place was far from what Richard had promised when they left the city. "Son, are you sure I can't stay with you? I don't mind having a small room in your new house." "Mum, we've already talked about this," Richard replied. a slight tone of irritation escaping behind his forced smile. "It's temporary. I just need to organize some things. You'll be fine here. It's a quiet place to rest. Wait for me in the room. I'm going to park the car properly, and I'll be right back." He handed the suitcase to the receptionist, who observed the scene with indifference. "Please take my mother to her room. I'll be back in a few minutes." Richard went out into the rain again, closing the umbrella as he got into the car. Through the foggy window, Helen watched him start the powerful engine. In her heart, a strange feeling began to form, a premonition she tried to push away. "He's just finding a better parking spot," she murmured to herself, trying to calm her growing anxiety. But Richard wasn't looking for a better spot. Once out of his mother's line of sight, his face transformed into a cold mask of determination. Without hesitation, he accelerated the vehicle down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the curtain of rain as he quickly moved away from the hotel. In the rearview mirror, the image of the small hotel grew smaller until it completely disappeared into the darkness. There was no regret in his eyes, only the cold calculation of someone who had just removed an inconvenient obstacle from his path. "Finally," he whispered to himself, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror before turning on the car's Bluetooth. He dialed a number from memory. "Camilla, it's me. Everything's taken care of. I'll be in New York tomorrow morning for the meeting. With your father, the family health issue I mentioned has been adequately resolved." On the other end of the line, the melodious voice of his fiancée, daughter of one of the country's biggest businessmen, expressed relief. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months from now, and the presence of a sick mother-in-law from humble origins was not in the heiress's plans. Richard smiled coldly as he accelerated even more, leaving behind not only his mother, but also the last ties that bound him to the poverty-stricken past he so despised. Ahead of him, he saw only the glorious future he had meticulously planned, the merger of companies that would make him one of the most powerful men in the country, and the marriage that would solidify his position in high society. The storm continued relentlessly, but Richard no longer cared. In his mind, the sky was perfectly clear. At the hotel, Helen waited, sitting on the edge of the simple bed, still dressed and with her purse on her lap. Minutes turned into hours, and gradually reality began to set in. Her son would not return. The receptionist knocked on the door after some time, informing her that no payment had been made for the room. "There must be some mistake," said Helen, her voice trembling. "My son just went to park the car. He'll be back soon." The young woman's expression was a mixture of discomfort and pity. "Mom, 3 hours have passed. Your son is not in the parking lot and doesn't answer the number he left at reception." The reality fell upon Helen like an unbearable weight. The tears she had been trying to hold back finally rolled down her wrinkled face. Her aged hands opened her purse with difficulty, searching for any money she could offer. All she found were a few bills that barely covered one night's stay. "This is all I have," she said, extending the money with dignity despite her trembling hands. "My son, he must have had some emergency. I'm sure he'll be back tomorrow." The receptionist took the money with obvious discomfort. "This only covers one night, ma'am." "We'll resolve the rest tomorrow," Helen replied, trying to maintain her composure, although her world was crumbling before her eyes. When she was alone again, Helen allowed herself to collapse. Between sobs, she tried to find an explanation that made sense for her son's behavior. She recalled the past few months, the diagnosis of early-stage Parkinson's, Richard's insistence that she sell the house where she had lived her entire life, the promise of special care in the city. And now she was abandoned in an unknown town, with very little money and a disease that would progressively rob her of her autonomy. Outside, the storm continued relentlessly, as if the sky itself shared in her pain and despair, but not even the fury of the elements could compare to the storm now forming in her heart. The following morning brought a clean blue sky, cruelly, contrasting with the darkness that had settled in Helen's soul. She had barely slept, alternating between periods of silent crying and moments of irrational hope that the door would open at any moment, with Richard apologizing for some unavoidable setback. But the door remained closed, and the phone he had given her weeks before received no calls. When she tried to call her son, it always went to voicemail. With the first ray of sunlight, Helen decided to go out and explore the small town where she had been abandoned. Perhaps she could find a police station, explain her situation, ask for help. She dressed in the same simple outfit from the night before, a navy blue skirt and a white button-up blouse, and arranged her grey hair with dignity, despite the deep circles that marked her gentle face. At reception, the morning shift employee observed her with curiosity and a certain degree of pity. Helen kept her head high, although her heart was in pieces. "Good morning, could you direct me to the town centre?" she asked with the firmest voice she could muster. "Just follow the main avenue, ma'am. About 15 minutes walking. But are you all right? Do you need anything?" Helen swallowed the lump in her throat before responding. "I'm fine, thank you. I'm just going to see the town a bit while I wait for news from my son." The lie was more for herself than for the receptionist. She needed to hold on to something, even if it was an illusion. Pottery Valley revealed itself to be a small, modest town of about 15,000 inhabitants. The streets were clean, though many houses showed signs of better times in the past. Family-owned shops, a central square with a small church, and many pottery workshops made up the scenery. Helen walked slowly, observing everything with the eyes of someone desperately seeking solutions. With each step, she felt the weight of her situation. An elderly woman, sick, practically without money, abandoned in a strange town. The Parkinson's, still in its early stage, manifested in occasional tremors in her hands, especially when anxiety increased, like now. After some time, she found the local sheriff's office, a modest building with only 2 patrol cars parked in front. Gathering courage, she entered and was attended by a middle-aged officer with a tired expression. "How can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, looking up from some paperwork. Helen hesitated. How could she explain that her own son had abandoned her? The shame burned in her chest. I'm having some difficulties. My son left me at the Haven Lodge last night, and I believe there must have been some mistake or emergency since he hasn't returned." The officer furrowed his brow. "Do you believe something might have happened to him? An accident, perhaps?" The momentary hope that appeared in Helen's eyes was palpable. An accident? Could that be the explanation? Maybe Richard was injured in some hospital, unable to contact her. "It's possible," she replied, clinging to this new possibility. "He was driving in the storm." The officer noted information about Richard, full name, vehicle description, license plate, and promised to check if there were any accident reports in the region, but his look revealed that he had seen similar cases before. "Do you have money to support yourself? Any relatives we can contact?" Helen lowered her eyes. "I have very little money and I have no one else. My husband passed away years ago and Richard is my only son." Leaving the sheriff's office, Helen felt even more alone. The officer had been kind, but her options were limited. Without realizing it, her steps led her to the town's central square, where some people were setting up colorful booths. "It's for the Pottery and Music Festival that starts tomorrow," explained a smiling woman upon noticing Helen's interest. "Are you a tourist?" Helen didn't know what to answer. What was she now? Without a home, without family, without direction. "I'm passing through," she finally replied. The woman, who appeared to be around 60, looked at Helen more carefully, noticing something in her expression that aroused her concern. "My name is Louise Fontaine," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I'm the festival coordinator." "Helen Mendoza," she responded automatically, shaking the offered hand. The tremor in her fingers didn't go unnoticed by Louise. "Are you all right? You seem tired. Would you like some coffee? My house is just over there." She pointed to a modest but well-kept house with turquoise blue painted wooden windows and a small garden in front. Helen hesitated. The little money she had was running out, and she needed to find solutions before the situation worsened even more. But there was something in Louise's gaze, a genuine sincerity that made her accept. Louise's house was as welcoming as its owner. Well-preserved antique furniture, family photographs on the walls, and a delicious aroma of freshly baked cake filled the environment. In the spacious kitchen, 3 young people worked animatedly preparing what seemed to be baskets for the festival. "These are my children," Susan introduced them with pride. Mark, the oldest, Melissa, the middle one, and Tyler, the youngest. The three smiled at Helen, briefly interrupting their activities to greet her. There was an evident harmony between them, a family connection that made Helen's heart ache as she remembered the coldness with which Richard had treated her in recent years. "You're not from around here, are you?" asked Susan, serving strong coffee and a generous slice of cornbread. "Are you visiting someone?" The innocent question opened the floodgates of emotion Helen had been trying to control. Before she could contain herself, silent tears began streaming down her wrinkled face. Embarrassed, she tried to wipe them away quickly. "I'm sorry," she said with a choked voice. "I didn't mean to be a bother." Susan sat beside her, gently placing her hand on Helen's arm. "Is something wrong, Helen? Can we help?" And then, like a dam finally giving way to pressure, Helen told them everything. The Parkinson's diagnosis, the forced sale of her home, Richard's promises of care in the city, and finally, the abandonment the night before. She spoke about the increasing tremor in her hands, about her fear of being alone as the disease progressed, about the uncertainty of what would become of her life from now on. When she finished her story, a heavy silence hung in the kitchen. Mark had stopped working and was looking out the window with a hard expression. Melissa was discreetly wiping away a tear. Tyler was gripping a piece of pottery so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Susan was the first to speak, her voice calm but determined. "You're going to stay with us." Helen's eyes widened. "No, I can't accept. You barely know me." "I know enough," Susan replied firmly. 20 years ago, when my husband died suddenly and left me with 3 small children, a stranger took me in and gave me shelter until I could get back on my feet. I vowed that day I would do the same when I had the opportunity." Mark approached and placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. "We have an extra room since Grandma passed. It's been empty for 2 years. But I have no way to pay, and there's my medical condition." "The room isn't for rent, it's shelter," Susan interrupted gently. "As for your condition, we have a very good doctor in town, Dr. Matthew. He works at the health clinic, and I'm sure he can guide you regarding treatment." The generosity of this family was so unexpected that Helen couldn't formulate a response. A spark of hope was born in her chest, the first since she had realized she'd been abandoned. That same afternoon, Mark and Tyler went with Helen to the hotel to retrieve her small suitcase. The receptionist seemed relieved to know she had found shelter and confessed she had been worried about her situation. The room in the foster home was simple but welcoming. A twin bed with a colorful crocheted bedspread, an old dark wood dresser, and a window that looked out onto the small orchard at the back of the house. On the walls hung some paintings of Clayville Valley landscapes, painted by their deceased grandmother. "This was my mother's room," Susan explained, helping Helen store her few clothes in the dresser. "She would be happy to know it's being useful again." That night, sitting at the dinner table with the foster family, Helen experienced contradictory feelings. The pain of betrayal and abandonment remained alive, an open wound in her maternal heart. But around her, the warmth of this family that had welcomed her without question began very slowly to bring some comfort. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away, Richard Mendoza was attending a business dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Boston. To his right, Camille Aldrich, his fiancée and heiress to the Aldrich construction empire, proudly displayed her engagement ring with an ostentatious diamond. To his left, Oliver Aldrich, his future father-in-law and one of the most influential men in the country, discussed the final terms of the merger that would make Richard a minority partner, but still powerful in the conglomerate. "And your family, Richard? When will we meet them?" asked Claire, Oliver's wife and matriarch of the Aldrich family. "Camille told me your mother lives alone. We should invite her to dinner before the wedding." Richard maintained his impeccable smile, although a vein in his temple pulsed slightly. "Unfortunately, my mother's health is quite debilitated. She's in a specialized clinic for intensive treatment. The doctors recommend that she avoid excitement and social commitments for now." The lie flowed easily. Richard had become a master at creating alternative realities about his past and his family. In his revised version of history, his mother was a middle-class widow who lived in seclusion due to health problems, not a simple housewife, who had sold homemade pastries for years to ensure his education at private schools. "That's a shame," replied Claire with apparent sympathy. "We hope she recovers in time for the wedding. Our family greatly values the presence of elders at important ceremonies." "I'll do my best," Richard replied, smiling as he raised his glass of expensive wine in a toast to the future. In reality, Richard had already buried his past on that rainy road, along with the last person who could reveal his humble origins. In his calculating mind, there was no room for guilt or remorse. There was only the constant movement toward the power and status he had always coveted. The night progressed for both mother and son in now completely separate realities. While Richard toasted to the bright future he had built on lies, Helen tried to find strength to believe that there would still be a tomorrow, even when everything she had known had crumbled. The following months brought profound changes to Helen's life. The initial adaptation was difficult. There were nights when she would wake up disoriented, not recognizing where she was, calling out for Richard through tears. Other times, she caught herself looking out the window, imagining if that would be the day her son would return. Remorseful. Susan respected her moments of sadness, offering silent presence when words weren't enough. The foster family had become her safe harbor, demonstrating a patience and understanding that Helen would never have expected from strangers. During the first weeks, Mark helped her file a formal police report for abandonment of a vulnerable adult. The sheriff's office managed to locate Richard in Boston, but when contacted, he coldly denied any responsibility, claiming that his mother had chosen to stay in Clayville Valley of her own free will and that he was tired of her emotional manipulations. "My client never abandoned Mrs. Helen Mendoza," declared his attorney in an official statement. "She expressed a desire to visit Clayville Valley during a trip and decided to remain in the town." Mr. Richard, respecting his mother's autonomy, accepted her decision, although he disagreed. Any accusation of abandonment is unfounded and will be challenged in court. The pain of that lie was almost unbearable for Helen, but it brought with it an unexpected liberation. If Richard himself denied the bond between them, perhaps it was time to truly move forward, without the painful hope of a return that would never happen. The Pottery and Music Festival, which was being prepared when Helen arrived in town, became a gateway to her new life. Melissa, Susan's middle child, was an art teacher and ran a community craft school. Noticing how Helen observed her work with clay with interest, she invited her to participate in a trial class. "My hands shake," explained Helen, embarrassed. "I couldn't make anything beautiful." "The beauty of pottery lies precisely in its imperfection," Melissa replied softly. "Shall we try? If you don't like it, that's fine." Hesitantly, Helen accepted the invitation. The first attempt was frustrating. The tremor in her hands caused the small vase she was trying to mold to collapse several times. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes, but Melissa remained by her side, patient. "Try to feel the clay. Not control it," she suggested. "Let your hands converse with the material." On the third attempt, something extraordinary happened. As Helen concentrated on the texture of the moist clay between her fingers, the tremor momentarily diminished. The small vase that emerged was irregular, with uneven walls and an asymmetrical shape. But there was a unique organic beauty to it. "You did it!" Melissa celebrated. Helen looked at her creation with amazement. "It's crooked and uneven." "It's authentic," Melissa corrected, "like real life. Perfection is boring. It's the irregularities that tell stories." That first piece, imperfect and genuine, marked the beginning of a passion. Helen began to attend the craft school daily, discovering in clay not only a form of expression, but also a therapy. The local doctors who monitored her Parkinson's noted with interest how focused manual activity helped temporarily reduce the tremors. The dance of fingers in clay engages brain circuits that can partially compensate for the dopaminergic deficiencies of Parkinson's, Dr. Matthew explained during an appointment. Additionally, stress reduction and creative satisfaction have positive neurological effects. Gradually, Helen developed a unique style. Her pieces, initially seen as experimental due to the irregularities caused by her tremor, began to generate Genuine interest. She incorporated natural elements into her creations, leaves, twigs, seeds, creating textures that told tactile stories. To her surprise, during the following year's spring festival, 3 of her pieces were sold on the first day. The money was modest, but it represented something far more valuable: independence. "I'm so proud of you," said Susan, hugging her after the sale of the 3rd piece. "See, your hands aren't just trembling, they're creating beauty." Helen felt reborn, although the shadow of abandonment never completely disappeared. In her most introspective moments, she still wondered how a son she had raised with so much love could treat her with such coldness. The wound remained there, slowly healing, but present. The years passed and Clayville Valley truly became her home. Helen now occupied a small annex specially built for her at the back of the Foster's house, a space that gave her privacy but maintained proximity to the family that had adopted her. With the money from her sales, she could pay for her own upkeep and medical treatment, preserving her dignity. Her art had also evolved. Trembling Ceramics, as her pieces were affectionately named by locals, became a regional craft attraction. Tourists came specifically to meet the lady who transformed tremors into art, a small local documentary about regional artisans dedicated 5 minutes to her story, omitting the abandonment but highlighting her resilience. And so arrived the 10th year since that stormy night. Helen, now 82, continued creating, although Parkinson's had progressed, requiring stronger medication and limiting some movements. Still, she spent hours in her small improvised studio, molding clay with the patience of someone who had learned that time transforms everything: pain into wisdom, abandonment into new beginnings. On an autumn morning, while working on a new piece, she heard a knock at the door. It was Tyler, Susan's youngest son, now a 35-year-old man and manager of the local artisans cooperative. "Miss Helen, a letter arrived for you," he said, extending an expensive paper envelope with the letterhead of a law firm from Boston. Helen cleaned her hands on her apron and took the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. Letters were a rarity in the digital age, especially for her, who maintained no correspondence with anyone outside town. She carefully opened it, unfolding the refined paper inside. As her eyes scanned the typed lines, her expression changed dramatically. Tyler watched with concern as he saw her grow pale, bringing her hand to her chest. "Miss Helen, is everything all right? Should I call someone?" She shook her head, unable to speak immediately. After a few moments of silence, she finally managed to say with a trembling voice, "It's about Richard, my son." The attorney informed her in formal terms that Richard Mendoza was gravely ill, afflicted with a rare degenerative neurological disease. His condition had deteriorated rapidly in recent months, and doctors estimated he had little time left. The law firm had been instructed to locate Helen Mendoza to inform her of the situation should she wish to make contact. At the end of the EA letter was a phone number and an address in Boston, not the law office but a residential address in an upscale neighborhood. Helen remained motionless, the letter trembling in her hands, but not just from Parkinson's. A storm of contradictory emotions swept through her heart: anger, hurt, concern, a maternal love she had never managed to completely extinguish, despite everything. "Is it bad news?" Tyler asked gently. "My son is dying," she replied simply, the words sounding strange in her own voice. 10 years without pronouncing "my son" aloud had made the expression almost alien. That evening, the Foster family gathered in the living room to discuss the situation. Helen remained silent while Susan, Peter, Melissa, and Tyler debated the possibilities. "You don't owe him anything," said Peter, the most protective of the 3 siblings. "He abandoned you when you needed him. This could just be some kind of manipulation. Or maybe he's genuinely remorseful," countered Melissa, always the most conciliatory. "People face mortality in different ways." "What do you want to do, Miss Helen?" Susan finally asked, bringing the focus to what really mattered. "Whatever decision you make, we'll be by your side." Helen looked at the family that had taken her in, feeling immense gratitude. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she replied, "I need to see him. Not for him, but for myself. I need to close this chapter to continue my life in peace, for however long that may be. The decision was made. The next morning, Tyler used the cooperative's phone to call the number on the letter. A secretary answered, confirming that the message would be relayed to Richard. Less than an hour later, the phone rang back. "Mr. Mendoza requests Mrs. Helen's presence as soon as possible," the formal voice on the other end of the line informed them. "A driver can be sent to collect her if necessary." "That won't be necessary," Tyler responded firmly. "I'll take her to Boston myself. We'll pass along the address so you're aware of our arrival tomorrow." As Helen packed a small suitcase for the trip, her hands trembled more than usual. What would she say to the son who had abandoned her 10 years ago? She had rehearsed this meeting in her mind countless times, imagining accusations, demands, outpourings. But now, knowing Richard's condition, all the planned words seemed inadequate. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, she found something she hadn't seen in years, a small, creased photograph of Richard as a child, smiling with his 2 front teeth, missing, embracing her during a rare day at the beach. The image of that loving boy contrasted painfully with the cold man he had become. Helen tucked the photo into her purse. Perhaps she would need it to remember that at one point there had been true love between them. The 5-hour journey to Boston was largely silent. Tyler respected her need to process the whirlwind of emotions, intervening only to ensure she took her medication at the correct time and to ask if she was comfortable. When they finally arrived at the indicated address, Helen was surprised. She had expected an ostentatious mansion, but instead they found a large yet discreet house in an upscale, secluded neighborhood. Well-maintained gardens surrounded the modern architectural structure. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tyler asked, parking the car. "We can still turn back." Helen took a deep breath, adjusting the colorful scarf she wore around her neck. A Christmas gift from Melissa. "I'm sure, but I'd like you to wait for me. I don't know how long I'll be." "I'll be here for as long as necessary," he assured her, gently squeezing her hand. With slow steps, supported by her handcrafted walking stick, also one of her creations, decorated with small ceramic elements, Helen walked to the front door. Before she could ring the doorbell, the door opened. A middle-aged woman, wearing a nurse's uniform, greeted her with a professional expression. "Mrs. Helen, we've been expecting you. Please follow me." The interior of the house was elegant and minimalist, expensive furniture, but without excessive ostentation. Photographs on the wall showed Richard at various social events, always impeccably dressed, often alongside an elegant blonde woman. There were also images of 2 children, a boy and a girl, probably between 8 and 10 years old. "Are those his children?" Helen asked, surprised. "Yes, Lucas and Sophie," the nurse replied. "They're at school now. Mrs. Camilla, Mr. Richards' wife, took them on a short trip to spare them from the difficult moment." Helen nodded, absorbing the information that she had been a grandmother for years without even knowing. Something in her heart contracted at the thought of the children she had never met. The nurse led her down a hallway to a wing that seemed to have been adapted as an in-home hospital room. She stopped in front of a door and said in a low voice, "Mr. Richard has periods of lucidity, alternating with confusion. The disease occasionally affects his speech, but his comprehension remains intact most of the time. If you need anything, I'll be in the anteroom." With that, she opened the door and gestured for Helen to enter. The room was spacious and well lit, with large windows overlooking a winter garden. In the center stood a hospital bed, and in it, almost unrecognizable, was Richard. The strong and imposing man who had abandoned Helen 10 years earlier had transformed into a fragile figure, his body visibly emaciated, his pale skin contrasting with the blue of his eyes. The same blue eyes that Helen saw in the mirror every day. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft beep of medical equipment and Richard's labored breathing. "Mom," he finally said, his voice hoarse and unsteady, so different from the confident tone he had always used. "You came?" Helen remained standing by the door, her hand gripping the handle of her walking stick until her knuckles turned white. 10 years of absence, pain, and abandonment condensed into this moment. "I came," she replied simply. A heavy silence settled in the room, laden with decades of shared history and 10 years of separation. Helen observed her son, searching for traces of the boy she had raised, the ambitious young man who had graduated with honors, the successful man who, at some point along the way, had decided she was a disposable burden. "Please sit down," Richard requested, indicating with a weak gesture the armchair beside the bed. The journey must have been tiring. Helen hesitated for a moment, but then crossed the room and sat down. Up close, the ravages of the disease were even more evident. Richard's eyes were sunk into deep circles, and his hair, once abundant and dark, was now sparse and grey. "I know I don't deserve your presence here," he continued, each word pronounced with visible effort. "After what I did—" "Why did you call for me, Richard?" Helen interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. She hadn't come to hear vague apologies or lamentations. She needed to understand. Richard closed his eyes for a moment as if gathering strength before answering, "Because I'm dying, and before I go I need to try to fix what I can. I know it's too late. I know it's insufficient. But I need you to know the truth." "The truth?" repeated Helen, raising an eyebrow. "What truth could justify abandoning your mother in a strange town without money, without references, without even an explanation?" A tremor passed through Richard's fragile body. Not from emotion, Helen realized, but an involuntary muscle spasm, a symptom of the disease consuming him. He waited for it to pass before continuing. "There is no justification. It was an unforgivable act, born of cowardice and selfishness. But I want you to understand what led me to it, not to absolve myself, but so that perhaps you can move forward in peace." Helen pressed her lips together, holding back harsh words. She nodded slightly, indicating he should continue. "When your Parkinson's was diagnosed," Richard continued, "I was negotiating the biggest merger in the company's history, a billion-dollar deal that would transform my career, secure my place on the board, my children's financial future." He paused, swallowing with difficulty. "Camilla was pregnant with Sophie, our second child. Lucas was only 2 years old. The pressure was immense. I was working 18 hours a day, and then came your diagnosis, the rapid progression, the need for constant care. So I became inconvenient," Helen concluded, the bitterness evident in her voice. "No," Richard quickly replied, trying to raise himself in bed and giving up from the effort. "You were never inconvenient. I was the one who was weak and cowardly. I convinced myself that I was just postponing, that I would come back for you in a few days when the merger was secured. I told myself that you would be safe in that small town, that it was only temporary." He coughed, and the nurse instantly appeared at the door, checking the monitors. Richard made a gesture indicating he was fine, and she reluctantly withdrew. "Days turned into weeks," he continued, his voice weaker. "The merger became complicated, requiring my constant presence. At home, Camilla was going through a difficult pregnancy, needing complete bed rest. The guilt grew, but the more time passed, the harder it was to admit what I had done." Helen listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, part Parkinson's, part contained emotion. "When the merger was finally completed, 3 months had passed. I tried to convince myself that you would be better off there, that you would have made friends, adapted. The truth is that I didn't have the courage to face what I had done. And then you decided that I had chosen to stay," said Helen, recalling the official declaration from the lawyer. "You transformed your abandonment into my choice." Richard lowered his gaze, the shame evident on his gaunt face. "I simply couldn't admit to anyone, not to my wife, not to my partners, not even to myself, that I had abandoned my own mother. So yes, I constructed that lie. At first for others. Later I tried to believe it myself." Helen rose from her chair, approaching the window. Outside, the garden displayed carefully cultivated roses, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in the room. "You know what's most painful?" she asked, without turning around. "It's not that you left me. It's that you didn't give me a choice. You didn't ask what I wanted, didn't consider that I might have found solutions. You decided for me as if I were incapable of thinking for myself." "You're right," Richard admitted, his voice breaking. I treated you like a problem to be solved. Not as my mother, not as the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me alone after Dad died. Helen turned to face him, decades of hurt and contradictory love reflected in her gaze. Why now, Richard? Why seek me out when you're dying? What comfort do you hope to gain? He closed his eyes, and for a moment Helen thought he had fallen asleep. When he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. 6 months ago, when I received the diagnosis, my first thought was about you, about how I had repeated the same pattern with my children, always too busy, always putting work first. I began to wonder what they would say about me when I was gone. Richard took a deep breath, the effort visible. I hired a detective to find you. I was hoping to discover that you had died, which would make my guilt more bearable. When I learned you were alive, creating art, building a new life, I was paralyzed between joy and shame. I didn't know how to approach you. Helen slowly returned to the armchair, sitting down again. The disease progressed rapidly, Richard continued. The doctors said I have only a few weeks. Camilla insisted that I try to contact you, that I give both you and myself the chance for a goodbye. Not because I deserve your forgiveness, but because maybe you needed this closure as much as I did. He extended his trembling hand toward her, a gesture so similar to the tremors she herself faced daily that Helen felt a pang of cosmic irony. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mom. I'm only asking that you know I recognize my mistake. That in the last months of my life, I finally understood what you always knew, that relationships are more important than achievements, that family is worth more than any fortune. Helen looked at the outstretched hand, hesitant. So many nights she had dreamed of this moment, imagining that she would reject any attempt at reconciliation with the same coldness with which she had been rejected. But now, faced with her son's fragility, she felt her resolution waver. Slowly she placed her hand over his, 2 trembling hands, one from the degenerative disease that would soon end a life, the other from the condition she had learned to transform into art. I can't say that I completely forgive you, said Helen, honesty being the only offering she could give. But I'm here, and that has to be enough for now. Richard nodded, silent tears running down his emaciated face. There's something else. I need to show you, he said after a moment. In the drawer of the bedside table, could you open it for me? Helen obeyed, finding an elegant leather folder. Opening it, she found legal documents and a bank book. It's an account in your name, Richard explained. Opened 10 years ago, when... He hesitated. When I left you, every month I deposited a considerable amount, imagining that one day you might need or accept it. Helen flipped through the bank book, surprised by the numbers she saw. It was a fortune, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, to finance experimental treatments for her Parkinson's, to never again worry about material needs. I don't want your money, she said, closing the folder. I know, Richard replied with a weak smile. You never did. That's why I've always admired you, even when I failed you so terribly. But I ask you to accept it, not for yourself, but for my children, your grandchildren, so that they can get to know you, so that you can be part of their lives in a way that I didn't allow you to be part of mine. Helen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. Grandchildren she had never met. Children who grew up not knowing their grandmother existed. Does Catherine know what really happened? Helen asked. Richard looked away briefly before answering. I told her the truth 3 months ago when the disease was diagnosed. It was difficult. She was horrified, almost left me. But she decided to stay. Not for me, but for the children. And it was she who insisted that I should try to contact you before it was too late. A light knock on the door interrupted the conversation. The nurse entered, checking her watch. Mr. Richard, it's time for your medication, and the doctor recommended not to overexert yourself. Just a few more minutes, Teresa, he requested. When she left, Richard turned to Helen again. Would you like to meet them? Lucas and Sophia. They return tomorrow. Helen felt her heart race. Grandchildren, family she never knew she had, a chance for connection she thought was lost forever. Yes, she answered simply. I would like That very much. A genuine smile, the first Helen had seen in decades, lit up Richard's tired face. They'll adore you. Did you know Sophia has a natural talent for art? At 9 years old, she's already winning school prizes for her paintings. And Lucas, he has your eyes. And your stubbornness too. For a brief moment, time seemed to rewind. They were no longer a dying man and an abandoned woman, but mother and son sharing family stories as they should have done throughout these lost years. The nurse returned, this time with medications and an expression that would accept no refusals. Helen understood it was time to leave. "I'll return tomorrow," she promised, rising with the support of her cane. "Mom?" Richard called when she was already at the door. "I never thanked you for everything you did for me, for all the sleepless nights when I was sick, for working 2 jobs to pay for my college, for never letting me feel the absence of a father. Thank you, I'm sorry it took a lifetime and the proximity of death for me to say this." Helen felt tears burning her eyes, but she didn't shed them. She simply nodded, storing those words in her heart, and left the room. Tyler was waiting patiently, in the car as promised. Seeing her approach, he quickly got out to help her. "How did it go?" he asked gently, opening the passenger door. Helen took a deep breath, looking at the house where her son lived and was dying. "Complicated," she answered honestly. "We'll need to stay in Boston for a few more days. There are people I need to meet tomorrow." During the drive to the small hotel where they would be staying, Helen remained silent, processing everything that had occurred. Part of her was still furious, resentful of the cruel abandonment. Another part felt the acute pain of seeing a son, her only son, wasting away, condemned to die young. And a third part, small but growing, felt a strange peace beginning to form, like the first drops of rain after a long drought. The next day, when she returned to the house, she was greeted by an elegant woman in her 40s, with eyes red from recent crying, but a firm posture. "Mrs. Helen, I'm Catherine, Richard's wife. Welcome." The meeting was initially tense, loaded with the weight of the history that indirectly connected them, but as they talked in the living room, while Richard rested after a difficult night, the barriers began to yield. "I never knew the truth until recently," Catherine confessed, serving tea in fine porcelain cups. "Richard told me you had chosen to live in a small town, that you preferred the tranquility to the bustle of Boston. When he finally confessed what really happened, I was devastated. I couldn't recognize the man I married." Helen nodded, understanding the shock it must have been. "What would you have done if you had known?" she asked, with no accusation. In her voice, just genuine curiosity. Catherine reflected for a moment before answering. "I'd like to think I would have insisted on bringing you to our home immediately, that I would have confronted Richard, demanded he correct his mistake. But honestly, I don't know. We were young, building careers, starting a family. Maybe I would have been a coward too. It's easy to judge past decisions with the wisdom that only time brings." This honesty disarmed Helen more than any elaborate apology could have. "The children never knew about me?" Helen asked. "We told them you lived very far away in another state, that you couldn't travel because of health problems," Catherine explained. "Richard would occasionally speak about you, stories from his childhood, but always avoided questions about visiting you. The children eventually stopped asking." At that moment, the front door opened, and children's voices filled the space. Catherine stood up. "That's them," she said with a nervous smile. "They're eager to meet you." Lucas entered first, a 12-year-old boy, tall for his age, with the same blue eyes Helen saw in the mirror. Right behind came Sophia, 9 years old with dark long hair, carrying a portfolio of drawings almost bigger than herself. There was a moment of hesitation when they saw Helen, the stranger sitting in the living room, who somehow seemed familiar. "Children," Catherine said softly, "this is your grandmother Helen." What followed was a mixture of confusion, questions, simplified explanations, and gradually, acceptance. "Children have a remarkable capacity to adapt to new realities," Helen observed. By the end of the afternoon, Sophia had shown all her drawings to her newly discovered grandmother, amazed to learn that she was also an artist. "You make pottery and sculptures? That's so cool," exclaimed the girl with genuine enthusiasm. "Can you teach me?" "Of course I can," replied Helen, feeling an unexpected emotion at seeing her own love for art reflected in her granddaughter. Lucas was more reserved, watching her with cautious curiosity, asking occasional questions about her life, about the place where she lived, about what it was like growing up in the old days. But when Helen shared stories about Richard as a child, the mischief, the achievements, the funny moments, the boy's eyes sparkled with interest. Days turned into weeks. Helen extended her stay in Boston, settling into a guest room in the house. Tyler returned to Riverdale Valley, promising to come back whenever she needed him or when it was time. Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly. There were good days when he managed to sit on the porch in his wheelchair, watching Helen interact with his children, a melancholic smile on his face. And there were bad days when the pain was so intense that only morphine brought relief, when his consciousness oscillated between present and past. In one of these rare moments of lucidity, about a month after Helen's arrival, Richard asked to be alone with her. "I'm happy you've met the children," he said, his voice now just a whisper. "They'll need you when I'm gone." "I'll be here for them," Helen promised. "Somehow." Richard nodded, briefly closing his eyes before continuing. "I know I don't deserve to ask, but can you forgive me, Mum? Not for what I did, but for what could have been and wasn't?" Helen held her son's hand, so fragile now, almost translucent against the white sheets. Her own tremors seemed to intensify with the emotion of the moment. "Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination," she finally answered. "I'm on that journey now, and that's more than I thought possible a few weeks ago." Richard smiled weakly, seeming to understand everything that wasn't being said. "That's fair, more than I deserve." 3 days later, Richard slipped into a coma. The doctors said it was a matter of hours, maybe days. The family took turns. At his bedside, Camilla, the children, and now Helen too. It was during a silent dawn while Helen was keeping her vigil that Richard took his last breath. There was no drama, no final words, just a soft sigh, barely perceptible, and then silence. Helen held her son's hand until it grew cold, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Tears for the boy she had raised, for the complex man he had become. For the lost decades they would never recover, and for the imperfect but real reconciliation they had achieved in the end. When she finally called Camilla and the nurse, she felt strangely calm. Death, Helen realized, sometimes brought a kind of peace that life denied. The funeral was discreet but elegant, as Richard would have preferred. Helen was surprised by the number of people present: colleagues, friends, important figures from the business world. Many came to greet her, expressing surprise at meeting Richard's mother, commenting how he always spoke of you with such fondness. Another lie, thought Helen, but one that perhaps contained a seed of truth. Maybe at some level Richard really did love her, even when his actions demonstrated otherwise. After the ceremony, when everyone had left, Helen stood alone before the freshly closed grave. She took from her purse a small object, a ceramic miniature she had created years ago, one of her first pieces, imperfect but genuine. "Goodbye, son," she whispered, placing the piece on the headstone. "I hope you find the peace you couldn't find in life." In the months that followed, Helen divided her time between Boston and Claybrook Valley. She found a balance she never imagined possible. One foot in her rebuilt life in the small town that had welcomed her, another in the new connection with her grandchildren and Camilla, who had become an unlikely friend. With the inheritance left by Richard, she ensured that her Parkinson's treatment had the best resources available. But contrary to Camilla's expectations, she didn't significantly change her lifestyle. She continued creating her trembling ceramics, now with Sophia as an enthusiastic apprentice during school vacations. A year after Richard's death, Helen was in her small studio in Claybrook Valley working on a new piece when Lucas appeared at the door. At 13, almost as tall as she was, the boy had come to spend 2 weeks of vacation with his grandmother. "What are you making, Grandma?" he asked, watching her shape the clay with trembling but precise hands. "A special piece," Helen replied. "Look." It was a complex sculpture, 3 stylized human figures intertwined, emerging from a common base like trees from the same trunk. "Is that us?" Lucas asked, recognizing the silhouettes representing him, Sophia, and his grandmother. "Yes," Helen confirmed. Family isn't just who's been there from the beginning. Sometimes it's those we find in the middle of the journey. Lucas observed in silence for a moment, then asked, "Do you still miss him?"